My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to TheAstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be talking about the most advanced dogfighter that humanity has ever developed in the universe of Star Citizen. Before we get into that, I want to thank y'all for your continued support. If you've been enjoying these videos, be sure to hit that like button, as it really helps. And if you haven't already subscribed, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to stay up to date on the latest videos. If you want to go that extra mile, we also have YouTube memberships and Ko-fi for financial donations. Lastly, if you want early, ad-free access to these videos, consider joining the Patreon as well. All those links are in the description. Now, let's talk about how the fall of an empire and alien raids led to the development of the future of the UEE Navy. The story of the Lightning can be traced back to its direct ancestor, the F-7 Hornet. The time the Hornet was being developed was a complex one. With the fall of the Mezzers, and thus the thawing of the Cold War with the Xi'an, there was a lot of changes occurring very rapidly inside the UEE. First, the end of the Cold War meant that the doctrine around space combat was starting to shift towards the Van Duel. While this had been the case for almost a century, the looming threat of the Xi'an meant there were still a lot of ships designed to counter the aliens' nimble and shield-reliant ships, like the Gladius. Thus, the UEE was in the beginning of the process of looking for new ships to replace the aging Aegis designs, one specifically meant to counter the Van Duel. Secondly, with the fall of the Mezzers, that meant that Aegis was entirely out of the running for any new ship, not to mention that many of the manufacturers for their parts had entirely disappeared in the chaos of the aftermath of the anti-Mezzer revolution. Thus, the UEE needed companies not connected to the old regime to build their new generation of warfighting equipment. This is where Anvil steps into the spotlight. They had only been a minor contractor, with only a prototype fighter called the Osprey that got into development just before the fall of the Mezzers. While we don't know a lot of details on the Osprey, we know that Anvil would be selected to replace Aegis as the main military manufacturer in the time directly after the fall of the Mezzers, with their biggest contract being to replace the current mainline carrier fighter of the UEE Navy, the Aegis Avenger. This would result in the F-7A Hornet, a design which not only proved itself in engagement with the Van Duel, but also with just about everything that it was tasked to cope against. In fact, the Hornet has been dubbed the most effective fighter in human history, and its long service record of over 140 years and counting has backed that up. However, the Hornet had its own issues. What made it so good as an all-round combat ship meant that it struggled against the more specialized heavy fighters of the Van Duel fleet. Now, ships like the Vanguard were capable of taking on these heavier class Van Duel ships, but they were old Aegis designs whose parts were difficult to continue to manufacture through the many logistical and financial issues of the 29th century. The UEE needed something as a hard counter to these heavier Van Duel fighters, something new and custom built. Thus, in the early 30th century, the UEE created the next generation starfighter competition for various companies to make this badly needed ship to replace the F-7A Hornet. 3 companies entered ships into the competition. RSI introduced their prototype Black Widow, Aegis introduced their Dogfighter 3000, and Anvil introduced the F-8 Lightning. By 2933, the Navy would choose the winner, the F-8A Lightning. There's some confusion about this competition in the lore, because it was introduced very early on in the game's history, like Volume 1, Issue 5 of the Jump Point magazine early. That was sometime around 2013. Since then, another entirely different competition with the exact same name has shown up in lore in 2946, which is where canonically the Aegis Saber was introduced. Because of this, I have a theory as to how this competition actually worked. It's my theory that the original competition was designed around countering the dreaded Van Duel Stinger class heavy fighter. I also believe that the Black Widow eventually was reworked into the RSI Scorpius, and the Dogfighter 3000 was an early version of the Aegis Saber. So, in the end, every one of the competition would make its way to the UEE fleet. Still, nothing quite compares to the beefy, gun-toting, flying turret battery that is the F-8 Lightning. When I say it's a flying turret battery, what I mean is that it has an astonishing 6 size 3 and 2 size 4 weapon mounts, with 2 size 4 missile hardpoints. It is intentionally designed with sloping armor to counter some of the most common methods for Vanduul attacks, ship-to-ship ramming with their various bladed weapons. Even the engines and cockpit have much more protection against these style attacks than its predecessor, the Hornet. Since the F-8A's introduction, it has been slowly replacing many aging ships in the UEE fleet, specifically the P-5G Gladius, who began to be phased out of the frontline combat around the same time as its introduction in 2933. The first group to get their hands on the F-8 Lightning was the vaunted 999th Reckless Test Squadron, specifically their airshow wing, who have flown it in air and space shows, demonstrating the capabilities of the space frame all over the Empire. Now, the F-8 hasn't entirely replaced all fighters in the UEE. Notably, the F-7A, the ship it was supposed to replace, still remains in active service with no sign of it being retired. In fact, in 2946, the F-7A got an upgraded version to keep up with its new sibling, adapting some of the same sloped designs as the F-8 while also improving its performance overall. Like most Anvil ships, the F-8 also got a civilian version, which seems to be the point of confusion to many people in the community, so let me explain how this tradition started. Back when Anvil was making the F-7A, the Empire was in turmoil. While it seems the core worlds of the UEE were mostly secured at the end of the Anti-Mezzer Revolution, many of the smaller worlds were still in control of Mezzer loyalists, like Locke in the Idris system, were rife with outlaws and pirates wreaking havoc, like Magnus, or were not too keen on remaining in the UEE as a whole, like Chiron. That isn't also mentioning the ever-present threat of Vanduul raiding and attacking systems. Because of how weak the UE Navy was, still rooting out Mezzer loyalists and reorganizing after their supply lines collapsed, there wasn't much they could do to ensure total control over the UEE. As a result, many systems began to form their own defense forces or militia for protection. Again though, after years of distrust of these groups by the Mezzers meant that most systems lacked the ships and equipment needed to safely protect themselves. Because of this, Anvil was approached by many in the civilian worlds to produce versions of their ships for the non-military market, especially their latest ship, the Hornet, which was seen as cutting-edge technology. Seeing an opportunity for profit, they asked the UEE for permission to make a civilian version of the F-7, permission which was eagerly given by the UEE. The government loved the idea of giving near-military spec ships to these militias because it took the pressure off of them to try and protect the farthest parts of the Empire. Thus, the F-7C and a new tradition was born. Almost every ship Anvil makes now has a civilian version as a result. Now, this doesn't mean that the civilian versions are anywhere similar to their military counterparts, however. It is said that up to 60% of the parts used to make the F-7A had to be swapped to make the F-7C. The closest Anvil ever got to making a pure military standard civilian ship was the F-7CM, also known as the Super Hornet. Even then, they had to increase the size and make it a two-seater to compensate for the loss of proprietary military tech. This is why the F-8C also exists. While the Empire is a lot more stable in the mid-30th century than it was in the early 29th, with war against the Vanduul still raging, many systems are without the required military presence to keep the peace, so a civilian version of the Lightning is in the same position as the civilian Hornet all those years previous, the right ship for the right time. Now, the F-8C Lightning is very much a cut-down version of its military sibling, with only 6 size 2 and 2 size 3 hardpoints. However, much of its stats remain the same when it comes to shields, thrusters, and power plants, and even its capacitors seem to be much higher grade than those on the F-8A. Though those may also change when it comes to the in-game stats over time. The point being that the F-8C is nowhere near the same level as the F-8A, and will likely never be. While it remains to be seen if the F-8 Lightning can live up to the legacy of the F-7 Hornet, it has started off with a bang, becoming the new king of spacefighter combat. Time will tell if the F-8 Lightning will earn its place alongside the greats of human fighters. But for now, it remains the peak of human innovation, in the face of one of its more dire threats. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'd like to thank those on screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, think about becoming a member on YouTube, and if you want a bit more contribution, join the Patreon. Patreons get early, ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running complete history of Star Citizen lore series, which I know is still in production. People keep asking for the fourth one. It's coming out soon, just after all of the chaos of CitizenCon and such. Check those out now in the top right if you want to know what you're getting. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on the F-8 Lightning and any other lore topics in the comments below. And, as always, remember, ex historia ad astra.